Jessica, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about another Michigan event, one that takes place in my home area. I'm going to be talking about the death of William Swan, the first black man murdered in Charlevoix County in 1870. A lot of the information I'm going to be talking about I found in an article written by Patrick Sullivan in 2017 in the Northern Express, a Northern Michigan newspaper. I'll have the article linked in the description below if you would like to read it for yourself. But before I talk about William Swan, I'm going to go ahead and talk about another man, Norton Bretz, who was interviewed in that article. Norton Bretz, a retired Princeton University nuclear physics professor, had family ties to the town of Eastport, Michigan. His mother was born and raised there, and his father was from the nearby town of East Jordan. His parents met in high school after both of their families had relocated to Detroit, and they discovered that they had both moved from northern Michigan. Bretz grew up, was later hired at Princeton University, had a family, and after retirement decided to move his family back to the town of Eastport in 2000, where he began researching local history. As Bretz was researching, he came across the story of William Swan in a book called The Pioneer Notes by Grace Hooper, which provided brief stories and accounts of local history. Norton Bretz was drawn to the story of William Swan's murder and wanted to know more, even though this was just one story among many. Bretz decided to do his own research and soon realized that he had family ties to William's murder. In fact, he learned that two of his own relatives had killed William Swan in cold blood on June 10, 1870. Before we get into William's story, I want to talk about what was happening in the U.S., or more specifically what was happening in Michigan around this time period in 1870. The Civil War had just ended in 1865, and we entered the Reconstruction period in American history. This is when our country had to try and solve the social, political, and economic problems that had arisen from the readmission of the 11 states that had seceded during the Civil War. This time period also coincided with the Michigan lumber era, which roughly lasted from about 1860 to 1910. Michigan really became the epicenter of lumbering during this time. Much of the state was covered in white pine, and these trees were very valuable lumber. Many trees were over 200 years old, could reach over 120 feet in height, and over 5 feet in diameter. By 1880, Michigan was producing as much, if not more, lumber than the next 3 states combined. This brought a lot of people to the northern parts of Michigan in search of opportunity or to capitalize on the lumber boom. And we start to see a lot of lumber camps popping up during this time, as well as a population growth in a lot of rural areas. So now that I've talked a little bit about what was happening during this time period in Michigan, I'm going to talk about William Swan and the events that led to his tragic death. From the little information we know, William Swan was born into slavery and was likely Charlevoix County's first black resident. He and his family were the only African Americans listed on the 1870 census, which was the first census to include race and to reach the northern Michigan area. William was married to a woman named Louisa, and together they had 6 children and lived by the town of Horton Bay, a small town located along the northern shores of Lake Charlevoix. On the day of William Swan's death, it was reported that he was walking on a trail, which is now US 31 near Atwood, Michigan, where he was on his way to the larger town of Traverse City, over 60 miles away, to pick up a relative. Now, I'm from this area in northern Michigan, and I know that it's quite a long trip from Horton Bay to Traverse City, especially when you are walking. So he was well outside of his familiar home area, and this would have been a very long trip on foot. As he was walking, he captured the attention of 30-year-old Gilbert Randall. Randall was a local butcher and a veteran of the Civil War. As William Swan passed by, Gilbert yelled to his wife, "If you want to see here's your chance." Now this angered William. He wasn't about to take this verbal abuse from Gilbert Randall. He decided to approach Randall and ask, "What have I done that I should be insulted in this manner?" Gilbert Randall didn't like this at all, and the two men exchanged some heated words. In an article written by the Grand Traverse Herald 6 days after William's death, it was reported, and I quote, "The colored man finally remarked that he had an instrument for quieting such fellows, and he took a revolver out of his satchel." It was then reported that Randall's wife intervened and calmed the situation down between the two men, and William went peacefully on his way. But Gilbert Randall was not willing to let his interaction with William Swan go, and he decided to travel to a nearby lumber camp to find a justice of the peace who could sign a warrant for Swan's arrest, as well as to recruit help for the situation. When Gilbert Randall arrived, he didn't find a justice of the peace at the camp, but he did find his 24-year-old brother, Charles Randall, as well as another man, that were willing to help him track down William, the trio resolving that if they found him and he drew his weapon, they would shoot him. However, there was another witness apparently present at the time of the murder, a reverend who had become aware of the confrontation between the Randalls and William and had decided to follow the men from the town of Atwood to Eastport. He later told the Herald that he followed the men in an attempt to prevent bloodshed, but heard someone proclaim, "Don't shoot," just before a shot rang out. Later reports by both the Grand Traverse Herald and the Charlevoix Sentinel said that only one shot was fired that night and that William Swan's weapon was found unused. Now, this evidence obviously contradicts the original story that the Randalls told the Herald of how William Swan supposedly fired a shot into the direction of the men. The newspaper would then go on to warn that maybe its original source, one of the Randalls, may not have been entirely truthful about the events that surrounded William Swan's murder, stating, "It is but reasonable to suppose that he would state the case as favorably for himself and his accomplices as possible." The account ends saying that as these men will have to justify their acts before a jury of their fellow citizens or bear the penalty of violated law, we abstain from characterizing their conduct as our conscience and judgment tells us it deserves. But there can be no harm in saying that no one believes Swan would have been killed had he been a white man. After the shooting of William Swan was reported to authorities, the Randalls were jailed in the town of Elk Rapids and charged with murder. Now, Norton Bretz, the man I mentioned at the beginning of the story, who was researching local history and family history and had come across the story of William Swan's murder by his own relatives, told the Northern Express in 2017 that even though everything seemed to be resolved and the Randall men were jailed and that the authorities were going to treat the murder like the crime it was, things slowly started to deteriorate. As they went through the legal process of trying to find a jury, they were unable to find one that was sufficiently unbiased. Because this area in northern Michigan at this time was such a small community, the Randall family ended up being related to basically almost everyone. The trial eventually had to be moved to the larger area of Grand Traverse County, where the initial instigator of the crime, Gilbert Randall, was tried first. Now, the records from the Traverse City Courthouse didn't really have a lot of information other than to summarize the prosecutor's argument. He had to argue as to why, even though Gilbert Randall wasn't the trigger man, he should be tried for the murder, the argument being that Gilbert was the one to recruit his brother to help him track down William Swan, and they had both agreed that Charles would be the one to shoot first. Gilbert Randall was eventually acquitted, and there was no mention of the case again in the Grand Traverse Herald. In fact, the newspapers in Traverse City didn't even announce the verdict. They just stopped talking about the case altogether. Now, it's believed this may have been because the editors were just embarrassed. Supposedly, they had spent so much time reporting on and advocating for justice for William Swan, and when that didn't happen, they just stopped reporting on it. But we don't know, it's just speculation. However, the Charlevoix Sentinel did report the verdict, taking the position, and I think most of us can agree, that the verdict was unjust. Charles Randall, the man who reportedly did fire the gun that killed William Swan, had his case moved north to Mackinac County. His trial was supposed to take place in August of 1871. The Charlevoix Sentinel would continue to write short articles about the case, questioning whether or not Charles Randall would even show up for his trial, because he was out on bond. But as it moved closer to the trial date, the articles in the Sentinel started slowing down until they eventually stopped reporting on the case altogether. And no further court records or information have been found, leading researchers to believe that the records may have been destroyed. And we may never know what happened to Charles Randall had Norton Bretz not decided to do some research into his own family tree and the murder of William Swan. While researching his own family history, Bretz came across his relative, Charles Randall, the supposed triggerman in William Swan's murder, and he had an interesting life following the events of William's death. It was discovered that he was living in Manistee, Michigan in 1875, where he had fathered a child. He married, had 7 more children, and then, not surprisingly, met up with a gang of thieves. And he and this gang of thieves would go on to break into houses and rob and ransack stores over a period of a month or so, before getting caught at the end of 1876. Justice, however, would seem to prevail this time and move a little more quickly for Charles Randall, and he was tried in January of 1877. Convicted the next month in February, and was sent to jail along with his 3 co-conspirators. Records would show that he was an inmate in Jackson Prison in 1880 before ending up back in Eastport, the place of William Swan's murder. It was there he married a woman with 6 children. This woman would not surprisingly divorce Charles Randall about 6 years later, but in a coincidence of events, the family home and the home that Norton Bretz lived in at the time the Northern Express article was written in 2017 is next door to the home that same woman and her 6 children lived in Eastport, Michigan, and as far as I know, her descendants still live in that house. Bretz's own grandfather was best friends with some of these children growing up. While being interviewed for the article by the Northern Express, Bretz says, "I've got letters from the children as they were growing up, and they think the guy, Charles Randall, was a bastard. He was mean to people, and they didn't like him." Norton Bretz also began to wonder why he never heard about William Swan's murder from his own family, since there were obvious ties to the crime and the Randalls. In fact, he frequently heard his grandfather talk about another murder that happened 10 years after William Swan's death, where 2 farmers had gotten into an argument, and one of the farmers had killed the other, but there was never any mention of William and the crime that happened in that same area. Bretz figured that his family and community at the time were probably too ashamed and embarrassed by the events that happened, and didn't want their home area to be connected to these tragic things, so they just didn't talk about it. And the members of the Randall family that were directly related to Charles and Gilbert ended up leaving northern Michigan at the end of the lumber era, so they weren't around anymore to remind the community of the murder of William Swan. Even though the killing does highlight the poor race relations happening in the late 19th century, it's important to also talk about how the community came together to help William Swan's widow after his death. His wife Louisa and their 6 children did not leave their home in Horton Bay. Louisa, being one of 20 children herself, had multiple members of her family move to the area to help her. She also found comfort in her local community, especially the area's Indigenous population. She said in a letter written to her sister shortly after her husband's death, "Let not the thoughts of the murder of my dear husband deter you for a moment. It was not done here, and better neighbors I have not lived with than these. They are indeed kind, and those Indians are so far from being savage that they are the greater part of them Christians." And this wasn't the first time the Indigenous or Native community had stepped in to help William and Louisa Swan. While researching the story, I came across another article printed in the Petoskey News Review in 2013. I'll have that article linked below as well, but the article talks about when William Swan, a former slave, fled to Michigan sometime between the 1860s and 1870s. It was the Anishinaabe, or Indigenous people in the area, that befriended him and helped him set up his farm near Undine, just outside of Horton Bay. William would have other relatives that escaped from slavery as well and traveled to Michigan to farm with him. At some point, it was reported that their family home had burned to the ground, and it was the Anishinaabe from the nearby Indian Mission Church called Green Sky Hill that came to help Swan's family by bringing them baskets of trout to feed them and even helped rebuild their home. In fact, it was the Native American community that gladly buried William Swan at Green Sky Hill in Charlevoix after the area's white churches refused to inter the body of a black man. Now, I have a personal connection to this church myself because I am Anishinaabe and this is my family church. I've spent a lot of time on the property growing up, and in fact, when I worked as the archivist for my tribal government, part of our department's duties were to take care of the local tribal cemeteries and burial grounds. And one of the cemeteries we took care of was the cemetery at Green Sky Hill. So I would spend hours there walking the grounds, repainting crosses, clearing debris, cutting grass, and I always would notice this one headstone in the old part of the cemetery. And it would always catch my attention because most of the grave markers are wooden white crosses or very small, age-crumbling stone markers. And this grave had a bright white stone plaque on it that read, Ishpeming, which is the Anishinaabe word for in the sky or above or reference to heaven. But it read Ishpeming, 1870, William Swan, born into slavery, the brave flight north, rest in peace, Green Sky brother. I'm sad to say it took me this long to really research and to learn who William Swan was and his story, but I'm glad I took the time to learn more about him. And even though there isn't a lot of information available and we don't know much about his life, I think we can learn a lot from the events surrounding his death. Unfortunately, the story of an innocent black man being killed is one that we still hear too much of, and that's just never okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put some links in the description below of some organizations you can donate to help support Black and Indigenous peoples and communities. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments down below what I should research next. And I will see you the next time.